The Industrial Revolution, ignited in Great Britain during the middle decades of the 18th century, represents the definitive rupture in the timeline of human civilization. Before this era, for nearly 10,000 years, human potential was capped by the biological limitations of muscle and the vagaries of the weather. The transition to an economy anchored in fossil fuels and mechanized production did not just alter how humanity made things. It fundamentally rewrote the human experience, altering our relationship with the earth, with time, and with one another. This epoch, stretching roughly from 1760 to 1840, was not a singular event, but a cascading series of technological and social earthquakes. It replaced the silence of the field with the roar of the engine, transforming a rural, agrarian species into an urban, industrial one. To comprehend the architecture of the modern world, one must examine the foundations laid during these chaotic, transformative decades. The British catalyst, a convergence of fortune. Why did the spark of industry catch fire in Britain rather than in the advanced economies of Asia or continental Europe? The answer lies in a rare constellation of geological luck, economic pressure, and cultural liberty. Geological destiny. Britain was sitting on a subterranean fortune. The island was rich in coal-black gold that sat close to the surface and was easily mined. As Britain's forests were felled for timber, causing a wood shortage, the nation turned to coal as a necessary alternative for heat. Alongside this fuel source lay abundant iron ore. Furthermore, Britain's geography was a natural logistical asset. No town was more than a few dozen miles from the sea, and a network of navigable rivers allowed for the internal movement of heavy goods long before the first train whistle blew. The agricultural precondition: industry requires a workforce, and that workforce was freed by the land. The preceding agricultural revolution had introduced scientific farming methods, crop rotation, selective breeding, and new tools like the seed drill, which caused food production to skyrocket. Simultaneously, the enclosure movement privatized common lands, pushing small peasant farmers off their ancestral plots. This created a surplus population, landless, hungry, and mobile, ready to flood into the burgeoning towns to man the machines. The climate of innovation. Politically, Britain was an anomaly. Following the turbulence of the 17th century, it had established a stable constitutional monarchy. The rule of law prevailed, protecting patents and intellectual property, which gave inventors the confidence that their creations would yield personal profit. This was coupled with a robust financial infrastructure. The Bank of England and a network of credit meant that capital was available to back risky new ventures. The high-wage trap. Economists often point to a specific paradox. British workers were expensive, while British coal was dirt cheap. In other nations, labor was so cheap that there was no financial reason to build a machine to do a man's job. In Britain, the high cost of labor provided a massive incentive to invent machinery that could substitute cheap energy, coal, for expensive human effort.
The textile revolution, spinning a new world. The first tremors of the revolution were felt in the manufacture of cloth. For centuries, the production of textiles was a cottage industry, a slow, domestic process performed by families in their homes. The equilibrium was shattered by the flying shuttle, 1733, invented by John K. This device allowed a weaver to work twice as fast, creating a bottleneck. Weavers were now waiting on spinners. The solution came in a rapid succession of genius. James Hargreaves. Spinning Jenny allowed a single operator to spin dozens of threads at once. Soon after, Richard Arkwright introduced the water frame, which used the power of rushing streams to drive spinning mechanisms, producing a durable thread that human fingers could not match. This invention killed the cottage industry. The machines were too large for a home and required a water wheel. Thus, the first modern factories were born, cathedrals of industry built on the banks of fast-flowing rivers. The age of steam, unlocking ancient energy. Water power had a major flaw. It was fixed in place. Factories were tethered to geography, often forced into remote valleys. The liberation of industry arrived in the form of steam. Early steam engines, designed by Thomas Newcomen, were crude, fuel-hungry beasts, used only to drain mines. It took the genius of James Watt, a Scottish engineer, to perfect the technology. In the 1760s, Watt added a separate condenser to the engine, exponentially increasing its efficiency. By adapting the engine to create rotary motion, Watt enabled steam to drive machinery. This was the moment the world changed. A factory could now be built anywhere in the middle of a city, next to a port, or atop a coal mine. Humanity was no longer reliant on the wind to blow or the river to flow. We had unlocked the solar energy stored in ancient fossilized plants. The skeleton of industry, the Iron Age. As steam engines grew larger and more complex, wood became insufficient as a building material. The revolution needed a skeleton of metal. Traditionally, iron smelting relied on charcoal, which was becoming scarce. The breakthrough came from the Darby family, who pioneered the use of coke coal that has been baked to remove impurities to smelt iron. This decoupled iron production from forestry. Later innovations, such as Henry Court's puddling process, allowed for the mass production of high-quality, wrought iron. This new abundance of cheap metal led to the construction of the world's first iron bridge and provided the raw material for the pipes, rails, and girders that would construct the modern landscape. The urban crucible, society in flux. The economic shift triggered a demographic tsunami. A population explosion, fueled by better food and earlier marriages, poured into the new industrial centers. Cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham transformed from market towns into sprawling, smoke-choked leviathans. The horror of the slums. Urbanization happened without planning. The new industrial cities were labyrinthian nightmares of overcrowding. Families were packed into cellar dwellings and hastily constructed tenements. The air was perpetually thick with the London fog, a lethal mix of coal smoke and chemical discharge. The factory floor, work itself, was redefined. In the agrarian past, labor was task-oriented. Now, it was time-oriented, governed by the factory whistle. The conditions were often dense. Workers toiled for 14 hours a day in deafening noise and stifling heat. To keep costs low, mill owners frequently employed women and children. Small children, some as young as 5 or 6, were used as scavengers, crawling beneath the heaving machinery to collect loose cotton, risking life and limb for pennies. It took decades of misery before the conscience of the nation awoke. The eventual passage of the Factory Acts began the slow process of reform, limiting child labor and setting the precedent that the state had a duty to protect workers from the excesses of the market. Yet, for many, this was a golden age. A powerful new middle class emerged: entrepreneurs, bankers, engineers, and merchants who amassed fortunes that rivaled the old aristocracy. They built grand villas away from the smoke, driving a demand for luxury goods that further stimulated the economy. This class conflict between the owners of capital and the providers of labor would become the defining political struggle of the 19th and 20th centuries. Shrinking the globe, the transport revolution. An industrial economy produces goods at a volume that local markets cannot consume. To survive, industry needed to move products efficiently. The solution evolved from water to rails. Initially, a network of canals slashed the cost of inland transport. But the canal age was brief, soon eclipsed by the railway. Engineers like George Stephenson applied high-pressure steam technology to locomotion. The opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830 marked the birth of the railway age. Trains were not just transport, they were time machines. They compressed distances, allowing fresh food, mail, and people to travel at speeds previously thought biologically impossible. Simultaneously, steamships defied the winds, turning the Atlantic Ocean into a predictable highway for trade and emigration. Global ripples and ideological tides. The industrial model could not be contained. It leaked out of Britain, carried by industrial spies and ambitious entrepreneurs. It took root in Belgium, France, and the United States, and later in Germany and Japan, each nation adding its own innovations to the template. The backlash. Progress always invites resistance. The Luddites, a group of skilled artisans, famously attacked the machines that made their skills obsolete. They were not simply anti-technology. They were protesting the destruction of their way of life and the devaluation of their labor. Intellectually, the era birthed opposing worldviews. The Romantics looked at the blackened skies and wept for nature, prioritizing emotion and the sublime over industrial logic. In contrast, political theorists like Karl Marx looked at the factory floor and saw the mechanism of history itself, predicting that the friction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie would inevitably spark a global revolution. The enduring legacy by the mid-19th century. The first phase of the Industrial Revolution had concluded, seamlessly blending into the second industrial revolution of steel, electricity, and chemistry. The legacy of this period is the very air we breathe and the devices we hold. It lifted billions out of subsistence, poverty, and extended human life expectancy. It created the concept of economic growth as the normal state of affairs. Yet, it also initiated the massive extraction of resources and the emission of carbon that constitutes the central environmental crisis of our time. We remain the children of the steam engine, living in a world built by the coal and iron of the 18th century.